In this lecture, we're going to be looking at, very quickly again, the review of the cosmological argument, which you were exposed to in our first class together. And remember, the cosmological argument is made up of three parts. It begins with the premise, number one, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist. Number three, therefore the universe has a cause. The cosmological argument seeks to show that the universe and everything in it had a beginning. We also mentioned how that for the longest time, prior to the argument for the standard model or the Big Bang model, the argument held by scientists was that the universe always existed, that it did not need a cause for its existence. But the standard model has shown that the universe is actually expanding, and that the universe is also not just in a state of expansion, but that the universe is depleting in its available energy, which is known as the law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. We also saw how the cosmological argument also showed that at the Big Bang, or at least the beginning of the universe, if we apply the modern standard model of the beginning of the universe, that this marked the beginning of time, space, matter, and energy, and that the cosmological argument calls for creatio ex nihilo, or ex nihilo, which is an argument that basically says that the universe and everything in it came from nothing. We discussed the idea that this is a preposterous notion, that anything can come from nothing, is logically fallacious. We also talked about how, since the Big Bang marks the beginning of time, space, matter, and energy, we talked about the cause of the Big Bang would have had to be something other than the very elements or effects that came from the Big Bang. And so, since time had a beginning at the Big Bang, we argued that the cause of time would have had to be timeless. Because space had its origin at the Big Bang, the cause of space would have had to be spaceless. Because matter had its origin at the Big Bang, the cause of matter would have had to be immaterial. And because energy had a beginning at the Big Bang, the cause of that energy would have had to be something extremely, extremely powerful. And we noted how each of these are actually attributes of the biblical God. The biblical God is timeless. He is eternal, transtemporal. God lives outside of time. And we also saw that since God created space, God is spaceless. That is to say, God is not confined through a three-dimensional dimension. He's not confined to our time-space continuum. And therefore, he's not just trans-temporal, but God is also trans-spatial. We also saw how the Big Bang marks the beginning of matter itself. And since the cause of matter would have to bring matter into existence, the cause of matter would be immaterial. And so the God of the Bible is also described as being immaterial. And so in John 4, verse 24, Jesus says of God, God is spirit, and those who worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth. In Luke 24 and verse 39, Jesus defines a spirit as something that does not have flesh and bone. In other words, a spirit is incorporeal. And again, since energy began at the moment of the Big Bang, the cause of energy would have to be extremely, extremely powerful. And the God of the Bible is presented as the Almighty, El Shaddai. Well, since the universe could not have created itself, then the argument has to be made, well then what was the cause of the universe? The cosmological argument furnishes a very powerful argument that since everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe therefore began to exist and had a cause, well then what was the cause of the universe? Well, something had to create the universe. And if something had to create the universe, whatever created the universe created it with order and created it in a fine-tuning manner. And this would suggest in a very strong way that the cause of the universe would have to be a personal mind, that is, a personal agent with a mind, and with the ability to create out from his mind or from his own will. And therefore, the cosmological argument remains a very powerful argument for the existence of God. When we consider the question that we also raised in class, if God made everything, well then who made God? We consider the fact that God by definition is uncreated, just like a bachelor by definition is an unmarried man, and a triangle by definition is a three-sided figure. So God by definition is the uncaused cause of the universe, that God by definition has no beginning, and therefore the cosmological argument cannot be applied to God, since God never began to exist. So by definition, God is an eternal, everlasting being, and therefore he is timeless and uncaused. There are a number of other arguments that I want to introduce you to, and I've posted these arguments as PDFs on the Populi section. So the next argument that I want you to look at is known as the ontological argument, and it is entitled, the file is the ontological and transcendental argument. So we're going to look at two arguments at this moment. First, the ontological argument, and then the teleological argument. So if you could look at slide number 1, you'll notice it begins with the ontological argument. And then if we move to slide number 2, this is the author of the ontological argument, a Christian known by the name of Anselm of Canterbury, and his dates are 1033 to 1109. 1033 to 1109. And this Christian, Anselm of Canterbury, was not just a theologian, but he was also a philosopher as well. And in slide number 3, we have here what's called Anselm's ontological argument. Now, this argument is an a priori argument. It is an argument that is based on self-definition of what exactly God is and what kind of a being God is. Remember, a priori means that something is true before experience. A posteriori means something is true after the experience. So let's look at Anselm's ontological argument. Number 1, our understanding of God is a maximally great being than which no greater can be conceived. The idea of God exists in the mind. A being which exists both in the mind and in reality is greater than the being that exists only in the mind. If God only exists in the mind, then we conceive of a greater being, that which exists in reality. We cannot be imagining something that is greater than God, therefore God exists. So this is typically, basically the argument that Anselm puts forward. And you'll notice that there's 6 parts to it. And you'll notice that premise 1 begins with our understanding of God. What is our understanding of God like? Well, our understanding of God, Anselm argues, is that God is a maximally great being, than which no greater can be conceived. So if we're going to talk about God, God is the greatest conceivable being that could ever be conceived. Well, what would a greatest conceivable being be like? Well, a greatest conceivable being would be a being who is morally good, a being who is morally truthful, a being that is loving, a being that is trustworthy. The greatest conceivable being would have to be a being that is everywhere present, that knows all things, is all powerful, and so forth. That would be a definition of God. Number 2, Anselm argues that such an idea of God exists in the mind, that we can conceive of such a God outside of just physical experience. The idea of God, he says, exists in the mind. But then in number 3, Anselm argues that a being which exists both in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the mind. So think, for example, of the Mona Lisa that Leonardo da Vinci drew. The Mona Lisa, if it only existed in the mind of Leonardo da Vinci and not in reality, it could not be as great as existing both in the mind of Leonardo da Vinci and in reality. In other words, since the Mona Lisa exists in the mind of its artist, that is Leonardo da Vinci, without it being drawn or shown, the Mona Lisa would never be appreciated for what it is. And so what Anselm was saying here is that if God is merely a figment of the imagination, that would not be the greatest conceivable being, because the greatest conceivable being would have to exist both in the mind and in reality. So keep that in mind. It's not just the idea of God. It's the idea of God existing both in the mind and in reality. Number 4, if God only exists in the mind, then we conceive of a greater being. In other words, a greater being is that which exists also in reality. Because if the greatest conceivable being exists, then it would have to also exist in reality to be the greatest conceivable being. Now, this may sound confusing at first, but I would encourage you to keep reading over these arguments, the Anselm's ontological argument, and eventually you will catch the gist of what Anselm is getting at. In number 5, he says, we cannot be imagining something that is greater than God, because God is the greatest conceivable being. There can't be anything greater than God. And he argues number 6 from this, therefore, God exists. So notice that the argument is not an a posteriori argument. It is not an argument from experience or data. Anselm is simply using the a priori argument. What is God? God is the greatest conceivable being. If God is the greatest conceivable being, then for God to be the greatest conceivable being, God must actually exist. If he only exists in the mind, he cannot be the greatest conceivable being, because a being that can exist both in the mind and in reality is the greatest conceivable being. So once again, it may sound a little daunting at first, but eventually you'll catch the gist. Now, if you go to slide 4, you have here Richard Dawkins' famous flying spaghetti monster. And Richard Dawkins has tried to argue that he could refute Anselm by simply saying, well, wait a minute, I can argue and show that the greatest conceivable being is the flying spaghetti monster. Well, here's the problem with Richard Dawkins' argument. It doesn't disprove at all Anselm's argument. Anselm's argument says that the greatest conceivable being is something that no greater can be conceived, and that the greatest conceivable being exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. The flying spaghetti monster, if you look at it, cannot be the greatest conceivable being, because the flying spaghetti monster does not exist in reality. Not only does it not exist in reality, but if you look at Dawkins' flying spaghetti monster, it has limitations. It has 2 eyes, it has pasta noodles and the meatballs, and that is not the greatest conceivable being. That is more like a cartoon. The God of the Bible is a greater conceivable being than this flying spaghetti monster, because the God of the Bible is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. None of the things which this so-called flying spaghetti monster has. And so Dawkins' attempt to refute Anselm's ontological argument fails. Number 5, slide 5, you have Bertrand Russell's cosmic teapot. He tried to argue that he tried to refute Anselm by saying he can conceive of a cosmic teapot that revolves around the earth, and you can see that in slide number 6 as well, Russell's teapot. And he tried to argue that it's so tiny that no one has ever seen it, but he can conceive of this cosmic teapot as existing. Now, again, when we look at this, this is not a fair refutation of Anselm at all. If you look at this argument, it does not explain the greatest conceivable being. Just because you can conceive of something, let's say you can conceive of the greatest conceivable unicorn, therefore that unicorn must exist. Well, a unicorn is still not the greatest conceivable being, because a unicorn is not a personal mind, nor is a unicorn omnipresent, omnipotent, or omniscient. And therefore, just like Richard Dawkins' arguments, Bertrand Russell's arguments simply fail at this point. In other words, Anselm's argument, which was originated about just over 1,000 years ago, is still being debated today in the classrooms of philosophy and theology, thus showing the contribution of Anselm to the area of philosophy. So remember, the word ontological, the word ontology, has to do with being. This is a question about the being of God. Now, in slide number 7, we want to take up an atheistic attack on the premise of Anselm. But this is an attack that tries to show that God is impotent, that there is something that if God is almighty, then he should be able to do certain things. So, for example, one of the atheistic attacks on this premise is, can God create a rock so big that he cannot lift it? If he can, then he is not omnipotent, because now there's something greater than him. or bigger than him. If he cannot, then he is not omnipotent. And so notice what the argument tries to do. It tries to corner the theist or the Christian into the corner and say, if God can create a rock so big that he cannot lift, then that means he's not omnipotent, because now there's something greater than God. But if God cannot make a rock so big that he cannot lift, well, then he's not omnipotent because he cannot do this. Well, C.S. Lewis many, many years ago called this a nonsense argument. And the argument tries to say, therefore, God is not the greatest conceivable being because God cannot do these things. The problem here is with the argument itself. The argument presumes that omnipotence means that God can do anything at any time. And the problem with this argument is that it rejects the idea that omnipotence has limits. Omnipotence does not mean that you can do anything at whatever time you want, because what this argument entails is that the ability to do everything means that you can violate the laws of logic, that you can do that which is absurd and that which is illogical. So here's the problem. Can God create a rock so big that he cannot lift? No. Therefore, he's not omnipotent. No. The reason why God cannot create a rock so big that he cannot lift is because there is nothing greater than God. God is the greatest conceivable being, and everything that God creates is inferior to him because that which God creates is a created thing. God does not duplicate himself. God creates things which are subject to him and contingent. Now remember, in class we talked about the distinctions between necessity and contingency. And we talked about how a necessary being is a being that exists in and of himself or itself. Contingent beings are dependent beings, that is, beings that depend on other things for their existence. Food, water, air, love, whatever it may be. A necessary being is totally dependent on nothing but himself. And God is the only being that we can call necessary. It's what we call in theology the aseity of God. And because God is the necessary being in this case, then what that means is God does not depend on anything. Everything that God makes is by nature contingent on him. And therefore, the universe depends on God, humans depend on God, the animal kingdom depends on God. All of creation is dependent on God for its own existence. As we read in chapter 4 of Revelation, verse 11, that God created all things because he so willed and they existed. That is, they exist as dependent entities upon the necessary being who is God, the Creator. And therefore, whatever God makes is necessarily less than he is, because it is contingent, that is dependent by nature. Therefore, we could argue that this argument, as C.S. Lewis rightly pointed out, is really a nonsense argument. So that is the ontological argument. The next argument I want to introduce you to is found in slide 8, known as the transcendental argument. The transcendental argument. And so this argument, if we go on to slide number 9, the argument goes like this. Premise 1. If there is no God, knowledge or logic is not possible. Premise 2. Knowledge is possible. Conclusion number 3. Therefore God exists. Now if you want to look at this argument in its symbolic form, you could see it on slide 9 under the line. If not P, then not Q. Q, therefore P. In other words, what the transcendental argument tries to say is that because God exists, then knowledge is possible. Rationality is possible. Dialogue is possible. If God doesn't exist, then such knowledge is not possible. That is the transcendental argument as set out in numbers 1, 2, and 3. Let's look at it again. If there is no God, knowledge or logic is not possible. Premise 2, knowledge is possible. 3, conclusion, therefore God exists. Now remember, the way arguments work, this is known as a hypothetical syllogism. The way arguments work is that if the premise is true, then the conclusion naturally flows from the premise. If the premise in number 1 is true, then number 3 logically follows from it. And so 3 follows obviously from 1 and 2. That's the transcendental argument. Now, who has proposed this? If we go to slide 10, this is the view that many presuppositional apologists hold to. And remember in class I mentioned that presuppositional apologetics and evidentialist apologetics are 2 different types of apologetic approaches in the church. Presuppositional apologetics argues that there are certain a priori presuppositions, ideas that we hold to prior to coming to the table, prior to experience. Evidentialist arguments, or apologetics, are arguments that try to show that Christianity is true by pointing to certain amounts of evidence, or after experience, after showing, for example, archaeological evidence proves the Bible, or the 5 minimal facts of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, some of these apologists who made this view very famous, the transcendental argument, are in slide number 10. Some of them are Immanuel Kant, the Danish philosopher, was a presuppositionalist in his approach to apologetics. And perhaps one of the most famous theologians in the West who made presuppositional apologetics the centerpiece of his methodology was Cornelius Van Til of Westminster Theological Seminary, who is pictured there as well. His student, Greg Bahnsen, at the bottom center, his student, Greg Bahnsen, was an advocate for the same presuppositional apologetics that Cornelius Van Til advocated for. And so if you read any of Greg Bahnsen's works, you will notice that he is a very strong advocate of presuppositional apologetics. Let's look at slide 11. Transcendental argument also imposes a lot of its strength in the laws of logic. And so the laws of logic, because they are a priori, because they are definitionally, self-definitionally true, many presuppositional apologists will use them. So let's look at some of the arguments for the laws of logic. So the arguments that are used are the following. Logical absolutes exist. Logical absolutes are conceptual by nature. This is slide 11. Are not dependent on space-time, physical properties, or human nature. They are not the product of the physical universe, space-time, matter, because if the physical universe were to disappear, logical absolutes would still be true. Logical absolutes are not the product of human minds, because human minds are different, not absolute. Logical absolutes are always true, everywhere, and not dependent upon human minds. It must be an absolute transcendent mind that is authoring them. This mind is called God. So notice what this argument states. The transcendental argument states that logical absolutes do indeed exist. Notice that they are conceptual by nature. That is, they are abstract. They're not concrete. They exist in the mind. And therefore, if they are abstract like numbers, they don't depend on space, time, physical properties, or human nature to exist. So if we look at the laws of logic and we look at mathematics, the numbers, then you will realize that mathematics does not depend on any of these things like space, time, or human nature. Similarly, so they are not the product of the physical universe, space, time, matter. In other words, the laws of logic or even mathematical numbers are not products of the physical universe. Because even if the physical universe were to disappear, these laws of logic would still exist, as would numbers. 2 plus 2 equals 4 would still be true, even if the universe disappeared. And logical absolutes are not the product of human minds. Well, because human minds are different. They differ on many things and many views. But why is it that the laws of logic seem to be the same and applied equally all around the world by all cultures and all peoples at all times? Because they're not the product of human minds. Logical absolutes and numbers, we could add numbers as well, are true everywhere. And therefore they're not dependent on human minds. They are definitionally true. And they are based on what? They are rooted ultimately on an absolute transcendent mind that is authoring them. And this mind is God himself. Slide 12, let's look at some of these laws. The law of identity states that A is A. And so the pen that I'm holding in my hand is a pen. A pen is a pen. And so the law of identity says something is what it is and isn't what it is not. Something that exists has a specific nature. A human being is a human being and not a rock. So the law of identity basically says it is what it is. I know it sounds a little maybe infantile here, but this law is extremely important for identifying what something is rather than what it is not. Slide 13, the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction states that A cannot be non-A at the same time. Something cannot be both true and false at the same time in the same sense. For example, I am here speaking to you at this moment, and I am not here speaking to you at this moment cannot both be true at the same time and at the same way. And so the law of non-contradiction is an extremely important law. We use this law all the time when we say that A is not non-A. Something cannot be its opposite in the same way and at the same time. And then if we go to slide 14, the law of excluded middle, either A is true or non-A is true. Both cannot be true, which would violate law number 2, the law of non-contradiction. A statement is either true or false without a middle ground. So for example, Socrates is mortal or Socrates is not mortal. And so it's one or the other. Either Socrates is mortal or Socrates is not mortal. You can't have Socrates is mortal and non-mortal at the same time. Socrates is mortal is either true or false. It can't be both. Similarly, the same can apply to the question, God exists. God exists is either true or false. Either God exists or he doesn't exist. God cannot exist and not exist at the same time. Similarly, Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is not the Son of God. Either Jesus is the Son of God or he's not the Son of God. He cannot be Son of God and not the Son of God at the same time, because that would violate the law of excluded middle and also the law of non-contradiction. I want you now to open up another slide, and that is the teleological argument. The teleological argument. If we can go to slide 2, the word teleology comes from the Greek word telos, which means end, goal, result, purpose, conclusion, and termination. And therefore, the Greek word telos has to do with not just the end of something, but what is the ultimate purpose of something? Why does the universe exist, and what is its purpose? What is the end result for the existence of the universe? The teleological argument is sometimes called the argument from design. And then we have something called the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle, from the word anthropos for man or human in Greek. Anthropic principle, conditions on our earth appear to have been deliberately ordered to sustain human life. Existence of water, the right axis of the earth, right atmosphere to provide right amount of oxygen to sustain life. The anthropic principle basically argues that if we look at our planet, the planet Earth, it looks like it was deliberately made to sustain life because it does have the right amount of water. Water is an absolute essential for existence. The Earth's axis seems to be exactly on the right place, 23.5 degrees. And our atmosphere provides the right amount of oxygen to sustain life. And so the anthropic principle is an argument from design that basically says that if we look at our Earth, it looks like it has been designed for human habitation and other life forms. If we go to slide 3, what is the teleological argument? Number 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance. Therefore, number 3, it is due to design. So the teleological argument in premise 1 uses a form of argumentation called the process of elimination. What it's basically saying is the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either 3 things, either physical necessity, chance, or design. It argues that it's not due to physical necessity, because physical necessity cannot explain fine-tuning. It can't be chance, because chance cannot create anything, cannot create order. Therefore, it has to be due to design. In other words, the universe was designed by a designer. And so, if you look at the premise, if the premise is true and you follow it through to 2, then 3 would be logically the true answer to points 1 and 2. If you go to slide 4, you will notice that this argument is provided for you. This is simply the symbolic form of the argumentation. You don't have to worry about this. This will not be on any of your tests or exams, so you don't really have to pay close attention. This is just to show what in logic, this is how these arguments would be described in symbolic prose. So here's just an example. Number one, if P, then Q or R or S. Number two, it's not Q, not R, therefore it is S. In other words, it's not physical necessity, it's not chance, it is design. Number five, one of the people who argued for the teleological argument was Thomas Aquinas. His dates are 1225 to 1274. We talked a little bit about him in our first class. And Thomas Aquinas made very famous an argument that is called the five proofs for God's existence. And he argues for the teleological argument in his what's called the fifth way. And so if you go to slide number 6, there's Thomas Aquinas, and this is a quote from William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith, page 101. And here Dr. Craig is discussing Aquinas' sixth way, his fifth way, his fifth argument. And notice what he says here, and I quote, "His fifth way, Aquinas, however, represents the teleological argument. He notes that we observe in nature that all things operate towards some end, even when those things lack consciousness, for their operation hardly ever varies and practically always turns out well, which shows that they really do tend toward a goal and do not hit upon it merely by accident. Thomas is here expressing the conviction of Aristotelian physics that everything has not only a productive cause, but also a final cause or goal toward which it is drawn. To use an example of our own, poppy seeds always grow into poppies and acorns into oaks. Now nothing, Aquinas reasons, that lacks consciousness tends towards a goal unless it is under the direction of someone with consciousness and intelligence. For example, the arrow does not tend toward the bullseye unless it is aimed by the archer. Therefore, everything in nature must be directed toward its goal by someone with intelligence, and this we call God." And so William Craig there explains for us the position of Thomas Aquinas, and that is that everything tends towards a certain goal or a certain end. We see this, of course, in the Bible in Colossians 1, 15 and 16. We see that in the Bible that the Lord Jesus Christ in Colossians 1, 15 to 18, that we're told there that he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, and that through him all things were made, and not only were they created through him, but they're for him. In other words, the creation was made not just through him, but ultimately for him. He is the end of all things. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, and he is the ultimate purpose in God's plans. And so everything that exists ultimately for the glory of God. And that is the teleological view in Christianity, that everything that exists primarily for the glory of God alone. Now, if we go to slide number 7, I'd like to introduce you to William Paley. And William Paley, his dates are 1743 to 1805. William Paley made famous the watchmaker argument. Richard Dawkins took a shot at him by writing a book called The Blind Watchmaker. But the famous watchmaker argument is based on William Paley, where he describes that if someone were to discover a watch, he would notice that this particular watch is designed in a certain way for it to function properly. So let's look at what Paley has to say, and this is going to be a lengthy quote, and it starts in slide number 8. Slide number 8. So let's look at this quote by Paley. "In crossing a hearth, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? For this reason, and for no other visually, that we come to inspect the watch, we perceive that we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. Example, they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion is regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, of a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner or in any other order, than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which could have answered the use that is now served by it. To reckon up a few of the plainest of these parts, and of their offices, all attending to one result, we see a cylindrical box containing a cold elastic spring, which by its endeavor to relax itself turns round the box. Now slide number 9, we continue. We next observe a flexible train, artificially wrought for the sake of flexure, communicating the action of the spring from the box to the fusee. We then find a series of wheels, the teeth of which catch in and apply to each other, conducting the motion from the fusee to the balance, and from the balance to the pointer, and at the same time, by the size and shape of those wheels, so regulating that motion so as to terminate in causing an index, by an equable and measured progression to pass over a given space in a given time. We take notice that the wheels are made of brass in order to keep them from rust, the springs of steel, no other metal being so elastic, that over the face of the watch there is placed a glass, a material employed in no other part of the work, but in the room of which, if there had been any other than a transparent substance, the hour cannot be seen without opening the case. This mechanism being observed, it requires indeed an examination of the instrument and perhaps some previous knowledge in the subject to perceive and understand it, but being once, as we have said, observed and understood, the inference, we think, is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, and there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose that which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. And that's William Paley, and this is quoted from Frederick Fair, Introduction to Natural Theology, selections by William Paley. And so you will notice in this argument that William Paley uses the example of finding a watch in a hearth, and he talks about its constituent parts and how all of these parts fit together, how all these parts seem to have been designed in order for the watch to work. This is very similar to the famous book by Michael Behe entitled Darwin's Black Box, in which Behe argues and uses the example of the mousetrap. Behe argues that for a mousetrap to work, all of its constituent parts must be able to work in conjunction with one another. If one of those parts is missing, Behe argues, the mousetrap cannot fully function. In other words, all of these parts have to be there in order for the contraption to work. In the same way, William Paley argues that if we were to find a watch, let's say at a beach, and we look at this watch, we notice that if we open it up, there are certain parts. There are gears, there's coils, and so forth. And he argues from this that the most logical conclusion to come to is that this item was designed by a designer. And therefore, William Paley makes the argument, from the smaller to the greater, that if something such as simple as a watch was created and made, and there's order to it, then likewise the universe also would have had to be created. And so I hope that these lectures, this lecture in particular, has been helpful, and it is my hope that you will look over these PowerPoints that I'm providing in addition to the other PowerPoints that we looked at in our first class together. And it's my hope that in reading them you will be challenged and that you will learn some of these new arguments that we did not have an opportunity to mention in class. And so I want you to pay some close attention to the ontological argument and pay some close attention as well to the transcendental argument and also to the teleological argument. And so these are some important arguments that Christian theists have used for the existence of God. And as you could see, they are very good arguments, and a lot of them depend on very important articulations of the premises. In other words, if the premise of an argument is true, then we have to concede that the conclusion of that argument is also true. And so I trust that this has been helpful and that you will study these materials as the quiz on the 30th, next Saturday, will involve some of these arguments that we have surveyed in this lecture. And so, until next time, we'll talk to you later. Bye for now.